I want to come back to the statement by Heideggerian that you guys started with this morning, because I think you oversimplified what's going on here. First of all, there's a loss in going from Torah to Judaism. From Torah to Judaism is one religion next to other religions. And I'm not even sure that Heideggerian, from these few words, that he's even talking about one religion among other religions, or the whole variety of religions, but he might be talking about something else. The thing that really brings us together, people and gods, I'm not sure from this. Religion was invented as a concept by the Persians. It's the way that the religion of a people is the way that people prays for the welfare of the king in the Persian Empire. Before that, there's no concept of, nothing corresponding to religion in that sense in ancient Greek. And then everybody else who conquers lands that were held by the Persians finds it a useful idea. And so they take it up. So that's where the Romans get the idea that there are different faiths and everybody, but it's only a part of one's life, right? That's fundamental to this notion of religion.
There's even prehistoric evidence of religion in a broad sense of the word.
No, there's relation between people and God. There's a way that people do things, right? But what the Persian word is dot, right? There's no equivalent to that in Hebrew before the Persian period.
There's no
equivalent of dot, daled taf, before the Persian period. People had a way. There's a Torah. There's a teaching about how to live your life. It applies to the whole of one's life. People are different because their whole waves of life are different. Okay, and every aspect of your life is permeated by your relationship to God. Right? It's not we have a religion. So especially Heideggerian. See, what I would be concerned about is Heideggerian is coming. At the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, there's a whole treatment of religion and politics. Religion is an aspect of life, and on the one hand. On the other hand, he's attuned to the old Roman notion of religion, which is what actually holds together the city with God, right? A religion, but then once again, it's not, you can't have in a place one religion alongside other religions in that sense, right? Only in the Persian sense. So I'm not, I think that I'm worried that the whole discussion up till now has taken. Also, the other puzzle is why is it in the subjunctive? Maybe Pierre can fill out the context. We can understand why isn't you guys treated it as if it was an indicative. The claim was made in the indicative. Religion is poetic in its essence, but I think that's not what it says. I think it under a certain condition, religion would be poetic. What's the difference if there is one?
Well, it's of course undersimplified what we are doing here, at least. No, of course, the poetological texts of Heideggerian are very complicated. It would be an own discussion about the whole text. For me, it was just well, in this hymn Andenken. I don't know how is it translated.
Commemoration,
remembering, or whatever. Yeah. There is this verse. Was bleibet aber stiften die Dichter. Mm-hmm. What remains is
what the poets have founded.
Yeah. So it's actually the same idea that the source of a world of meaning, if you want to say it like that, is poetry, Poiēsis. For me, it was just this idea, and I have to say, as far as I remember, it's unfolded in this poetological text with other words, of course, with other contexts and so on. The conjunctive is you are right. It's used as a conclusion. He says something before that. If this is like that, if this is like that, then it could be like that. But it doesn't mean that the conclusion is just only concentrated on a minor idea. It is indeed these kind of question: how what poetry does in a community, what the poets or what poetry can do in what is the task concerning the world or the being in the world of a poet. In this context, this phrase then comes on. But these by the way, the other thing, these poetological texts are all fragments. They are not worked out in a way. So of course my use was also fragmentic, if you want to say so. But for me, I thought that actually we really could talk about this poetical extreme idea of Hölderlin, who comes from a Protestant father house. His family was deeply rooted in Swabic Pietism. He comes from this background, and he becomes a poet, and he has suddenly this idea: what is actually a poet? And he then, he comes to the conclusion that religion, religio, it's a Roman term, of course. That religion is also at its source poetical. This is definitely the idea he has also in the background of this "Was bleibet, aber stiften die Dichter." I always thought that this is not true, by the way.
Why not?
No, it's nonsense.
Why?
You cannot say that. Why?
Yeah.
I don't know what does that mean. What remains is given by or is founded by the poets.
This line that
this
poets
line,
religion is.
Yeah, I think this is a very desperate verse actually, because Hölderlin knew that this was not true in a way. Well, one can interpret this phrase in a certain way, of course, but I guess it's a over exaggeration of a poet. For a poet, I would say that, but I don't think that, for instance, sickness remains because of the poets. Or it's
but the Heideggerian reading of Dichter, which is hyperbolic. Heidegger, just as he says of the pre-Socratic philosophers that not all of them are anfängliche Denker, which I always found a little bit funny, but only 3 of them. Among the pre-Socratics, there's only 3. There's Anaximander, there's Heraclitus, and Parmenides. And the other ones are not anfänglich. He says it very categorically, on the Anfang in 70. So I assume he would say the same thing about poets. Not all poets, just because you write beautiful poetry, doesn't mean you're a poet who founds. You're not a stifter.
No, of course it's a Homeric model. Herodot says that the gods of the Greeks are given by Homer.
Yes, in that sense.
In this sense, this is the level of thinking about poetry here.
But you don't agree?
But
if that hyperbolic reading is
what
right,
is poetry
right.
today? What is poetry today?
Well, it's not that.
No,
it's not that.
So,
no, poetry. I mean, of course, in the prosaic sense of the word, for sure, it's not true. But a poet in that extreme Heideggerian sense of the word, which only happens in the Anfang.
Yeah,
it can only be Homer or Hesiod. It can't be somebody else. Maybe be Dante, for example, as a founder of Italian.
I just want to say I love this context, of course, and I love, of course, Hölderlin, and I love all these gigantic dramatizations of poetry. But what you as a philosopher, you also have to be able to speak about what is, in a way, huh? And what
yes.
You cannot just use these gigantic categories or these gigantic concepts. Then you don't understand what is actually happening today. But there is also this other verse of Hölderlin, wozu Dichter in dürftiger Zeit? Why poets in what is it?
Needy or desperate times.
Desperate times or
Desperate
whatever.
times, I don't know.
So Hölderlin saw the problem. So he saw the backside of what is written, what is in this verse.
Yeah. Well, look, again, so definitely, I mean, to get to if we can, maybe to Michael's question, I don't know. I mean, definitely in a simple sense, and I think very, as you're rightly saying, the very important sense, most poets just don't qualify as founders of religion, founders of reality. There are a lot of poets in history, and we're not going to say that all of them are Stifter. I think that would be silly. And therefore, it's a betrayal of the word poetry to make it work so hard.
But
it's really putting a lot of weight on the word poetry.
Therefore, I thought that was not the real philosophical problem. The more philosophical problem is whether poiesis as an event with the medium of a poet, of course, like you said. But the question is religion the source of religion God or the divine himself, or is it poiesis like everything else? Then we have the problem of the status of a holy text, for instance. What is then a holy text? This I found was the more interesting.
I mean,
question.
Michael already addressed that because he said you simplify too much with the whole discussion of Virgil, right? That the poiesis is poiesis done by man. You've assumed that, right? Your formulation of the question assumes that. That you can't. I think that that's begging very important questions.
Well, maybe whatever the divine is the master poet.
Well, that's the issue in a way, isn't it? That's the question. That's the real issue at stake, no?
In terms of Kabbalah, it actually does work because God is made poetically.
Mm-hmm.
God is made. Self. God is the poem that writes itself.
Because even if you understand the Sfirot metaphysically or ontotheologically, there's still, and this goes back to the essay of Sholem that you mentioned during the break, they're still configured as an anthropos in the human imagination.
The divine.
Yeah. Mm. There's a verse that's translated in Zohar, Noda b'sharim ba'ala, which literally means her husband, and it's talking about the husband of wisdom, is known in the gates. So the Zoharic author reads, Sha'arim l'fum man de mesha'er b'libei, according to the way it's imagined in the heart. Mm. Right? So the divine anthropos, or in the language that the Jewish mystics have used since probably late antiquity, the shiur koma, the measure of the divine stature, is configured or imagined in the heart, which I take to be the imagination. So in that sense, it actually resonates very much with the way Peter's presenting.
Do we agree that, I mean, just to get to Michael's question, that, you know, he seems to be speaking about a religion which is post-poetic in a sense that we're talking about here.
Well, okay.
It's already a technical religion. It's a religion where like the Persians are saying, look, this is religion, this is basketball, this is... Michael's saying that religion as something distinct from life. As one aspect of life. You know, you go to the Department of Religion, of Art, you have different departments in life. Technology, science, transportation, food, right? Religion also, Sunday we have religion. Whereas primitive religion, of course, he's right that the word is not used at that point in history, right? Primitive religion, you cannot distinguish from life.
I understand.
Yeah so I think we agree that when we're talking about poiesis, that's what we're talking about, no?
We're talking about the more primitive or
the more primitive. The poetry. He's saying that poetry is being.
I don't have to be hung up on the word religion here, but the point is that that from the Kabbalistic perspective, it does seem to me accurate to phrase the matter in these terms, that there is a poetic construction of divinity that goes on. And even if we assume that the divine emanations have a being independent of the human, they are configured in the human imagination. In the absence of the human imagination, there will be no representation of the divine. And in that sense, I see it as a poiesis.
Yeah, as a divine poiesis. Or
Yeah, as the divine being created through the act of poiesis. It's a making,
but it's
making of the divine.
Okay, so it has the logic of a noesis noesios. In other words, there's an involuted logic where it is creating itself, as it were. It's auto-creation.
Oh, okay, in that sense, yeah.
It's auto-creation.
That
yeah?
kind of circularity, yeah.
What do you think, if I may? I was always very impressed. There's a text by Viktor Frankl called Der Unbewusste Gott, the unconscious God, where he takes on Freud's idea of religion as projection of the Father image onto the divine. So, and he says basically like this, just to paraphrase him, he says, we could say that Freud is saying that religion is a poem, is a metaphor, which is a poetic device, right? It's a poetic device, a metaphorical device, whereby the human psyche, the finite human psyche, generates an image, in its own image, as Feuerbach would say, of the divine. So it is a poetic act of, as it were, looking in the mirror and seeing humanity writ large. Now, what Frankl says is a very interesting thing. He says, that's not bad. He says, but what if it's the other way around? The way he puts it is, he puts it like this. He says it's true. Freud says, what is God? God is the Father in the sky, right? Frankl says, you know what? What if fathers are God being poetic? God is saying, look, I need people to understand things. Well, the only way I can do that is by creating fathers. And that is a poetic act. And therefore, once that poetic act is in place, it can easily be reversed, like Feuerbach does or Freud does, and say, yeah, well, God is really a father. Okay, it's true, but that's because fathers are God, in a sense.
Okay.
You see the nafkamina. For me, the difference is, of course, quite important. I think you can feel that, because the Feuerbachian discourse, which Freud takes up,
Would be reductive.
And it would say, of course, the whole of religion is one gigantic bluff, which is based
illusion.
an illusion based on human neuroses and who knows what.
Psychosis.
And then Frankl, who's a deeply religious man, would say, well, that is only true because there's a much deeper poem going on here.
Well, yeah, in the terms of the history of religion, you could say there's a relationship between anthropomorphism and theomorphism, right? So one would be the representation of God as human, the other the representation of human as God. And think of Genesis 1:26 over it against Ezekiel 1:26. So 1:26 is God creates Adam in God's image, and Ezekiel 1:26 is a vision of the image of the likeness of the glory of the Lord in human form. So those are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Well, there's of course this the saying of the imago Dei. Yeah? So also as a problem, as a fact of a problem. But I think that what Scholem says in this essay is that he's arguing for that anthropomorphism is unavoidable in a way, I guess, if I remember correctly. And that would be the point here, that I think what for a religion, but you don't like the term, maybe this is now this is the point to come to esotericism.
Okay.
Because I guess that would be now the question, whether there is a secret or a mystery, a secret about the divine, what withdraws from from these problems we talked about now. Or I don't know.
Maybe. Well,
because
okay, let's pursue it. Why
because
not?
in
Let's
this,
pursue it.
but there are
Somebody
other
else
questions,
wants
of course. There are other questions, maybe.
Yeah.
So this is not so different from exactly this point, so that's why I wanted to ask it now. I've really enjoyed this, and I've learned a lot, so thank you all. I'm going to read just a little bit from Derrida's essay, Above All, No Journalists, just the beginning. I will begin by suspending a question, which, one concerning fathers and sons, what must God have said to Abraham? What could and should he have told him? You know full well there are libraries full of interpretations in literature on this unheard of event, on what took place and what didn't take place. But one can propose in all certainty, without knowing anything else, that what he must have told him can be summarized thus: above all, no journalists. And Derrida translates in the next paragraph. What happens?
No journalists.
No.
This is the Akedah, Genesis 22.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So to translate, what happens here, my summons and your response, your responsibility, here I am, Hanani. All of this must remain absolutely secret, just between us. It must remain unconditionally private, our internal affair and inaccessible. Don't tell anyone about it.
Yeah.
So the essay is really wonderful, and when you talked about 2 days ago about the goodness of religion, I mean, I think it comes up here. There's the difference between Judaism and Christianity. Christianity, you have good news. Here, Derrida is saying this isn't news at all. What is distinctive about Judaism is that it's non-mediated. No journalists.
But of course, that's empirically false because Genesis 22 is right there, journalized.
I think this is the challenge, right?
But what is I don't hear the challenge because Genesis 22 is a text, it's extant, it's everywhere. Sure. The journalism worked. So what was failed to be reported?
Are there journalists?
That's the question.
Well, somebody wrote Genesis 22.
No, but is it a term? What is the Hebrew term for journalism?
No.
Hebrew term for journalism?
Chadashot. I don't know. I mean,
Biblically speaking?
Well, yeah.
So I read that not to get to a linguistic question about whether or not there's a Hebrew word for journalist, right? But to ask.
But this is, if I recall, why can't it be spoken? Why can't it be spoken? Because I'm just looking at my notes here. Because the biblical narrative of the Akedah, the attempted sacrifice, is articulates for Derrida the nature of secrecy, which is precisely that which can never be spoken. Right? Is it always a duplicity or a doubling of the secret? Am I right? Is that what he says in this essay?
This silence seems in certain manner to be more decisive than the terrible story of the son to be put to death by his father. It's precisely that.
Yeah, precisely that. That's what I thought.
So the question is...
And does he mention Kierkegaard also there?
Of course. It's genuinely the next line. You can't... it's right there. So the essay goes into Kierkegaard and the difference between Jewish religion and other religions. What does it mean to tremble? The reason I bring this up...
So it's a double bind, what he calls the double bind of the secret. Yeah.
There's a few selfish reasons why I asked this. I haven't been at a conference in a while where there's such elaborate cameras and lighting, right? I mean, it feels like this is an event, a news event. But I don't know at some level what we're talking about at the moment, right? We've had really interesting conversations, right? You've discussed really deep things, and you're going, is what you're talking about something that can be discussed? What is happening when you're talking about this secret? We don't have to be talking about the binding of Isaac, right? In all these conversations that we've had, there's been something that cannot be expressed, and yet we decide to talk about it. We're trying to talk about it. Are there felicity conditions for that kind of conversation?
First of all, I think we're talking specifically up until now as about Poiēsis. Mm-hmm. So it's a real topic. It's a definite topic, and maybe hasn't been clear enough, but Poiēsis is the deepest secret, as it were, the deepest type of poetry, you could say, as it were. And the question is whether religion, and that's a problematic term, but to what extent we have to understand our relationship to God as a profoundly poetic event. It's a rather esoteric topic, I guess, but that is the topic, no?
Well,
No?
yeah. Well, I don't think the question was about whether or not there are topics that are, but I take the point. I mean, in a Derridian register, there is an impossibility of speaking about anything about which we have been speaking.
Look,
That seems to
Yes,
me not unfair.
no, not unfair at all. I would only maybe add that
There's a kind of a denegation, as he refers, a denegation, right? It negates itself even as it affirms itself. The affirmation is itself a negation, which, by the way, I think there's a tremendous indebtedness to Heidegger, which isn't always acknowledged on Derrida's part, but that's just my opinion.
do you think that sorry, I just want to ask this one thing. Do you think that the impossibility of speaking
Doesn't mean we don't speak.
okay. So,
Silence.
yes. So, is it possible that the impossibility of speaking is actually responsible for the proliferation of speaking?
Precisely, that's the whole point. Right.
In which case, so if to put it in if I may, to put it in the context of your question, I don't know if Derrida ever had a chance to read Erich Auerbach's text Mimesis, where the first chapter deals with the Akedah. Now, Auerbach was a literary critic. He wasn't a philosopher, but he says something quite beautiful in his first text of Mimesis. He says he contrasts. It's called Die Narbe Odysseus, the scar of Odysseus. He contrasts Genesis 22 with a moment in the Odyssey where Odysseus returns and is identifying him, or actually concealing his identity from his household, and the old maid that raised him as a child is washing his feet, and the goddess Athena has transformed into an old man who's unrecognizable. She's washing his legs, and suddenly she realizes there's a scar on his leg that she knows very well because when he was a kid, she remembers tending to that scar. And Homer goes on at length to describe the history of the scar and so on. Now, Auerbach says this is a fundamental difference between Greek writing and Jewish writing, between the Torah and Greek writing. And he says what's extraordinary about Genesis 22, by contrast with Homer, is how little it says. He says in Genesis 22, you have the secrets of the entire world condensed into one biblical chapter. In Homer, you have verbal diarrhea over a detail, over a scar. And Auerbach uses a very interesting term. He says that the biblical narration, taking Genesis 22 as an example, is an example of what he calls hintergründlich, which they translate as fraught with background. The biblical story has so much background in it, and what this background does, this is a literary critic writing, he says what the background does, the heavy, heavy background which is submerged in silence, its background, he says the reader, the literary critic, is obliged to confront that silence with a lot of talking. And that's what generates commentaries, biblical commentaries. Whereas with Odysseus, it's not as necessary because Odysseus is so explicit about this scar, it doesn't generate as much conversation as the hiddenness and the silence of Genesis 22. So it could be that the unsayable in Genesis 22 and elsewhere is precisely the source of talking too much.
Derrida says, speaking in order not to say anything is always the best technique for keeping a secret.
The point is that there is also, for instance, I quoted the seventh letter of Plato, and you probably know that this is the document of a certain school of Plato interpretation in Germany from the 50s, where it's spoken of an esoteric teaching in Plato. And I think, of course, this Derriderian problem, what he sees, what also I think in his Meister Eckhart interpretation also is about negative theology. It's the same argument. is of course true, but in a broader sense, the difference between esotericism and exotericism is also a discourse about what actually philosophy is. Yeah, and therefore the Platonic problem is a little bit more. You have even to see a political dimension in what Plato does there. If Socrates, for instance, says to whatever Glaucon in the Politeia, well, I explained this I explained this for you, but what comes now you will never understand. And then he speaks about dialectics, because he knows that there is somebody I don't want to talk about. I don't want to teach anymore these things. And this is in the seventh letter, of course. Also, it's like that there is said about the highest things you cannot talk.
Okay, but you can't speak at all.
Yeah, you can't.
But that's different. Then.
That's different to the Politeia. But nevertheless, the decision what is done there in the seventh letter is that don't stop speaking, but just speak on in the academy. And have an experience, and this is also, I guess, something what is also not unimportant, that esotericism can be connected with a certain experience. In Neoplatonism, well, in the Henosis, it's there, but also in what Plato calls the ex eifne, that the soul catches fire ex eifnes, in talking. Not saying the highest truth, but in talking, and this would be then the discourse of esotericism and exotericism would be also a discourse of a certain, well, mysticism is always about that, about a certain experience, an experience which cannot be spoken out in the context of a public plenum or something like that.
Well,
Unmediated experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are a couple of different. You could have a commitment to not speaking, silence, or you can have a commitment to an apophatic mode of speaking not, which means speaking at the same time that you're not speaking, which is, I think, what Derrida is trying to translate. And then the last thing, so you could have a kind of political esotericism where it may be necessary to hide the truth from, right? But you can also have, even within the circles of initiates, where if the truth is ultimately incommunicable and ineffable, then the only way you can approach it is through that speaking not, which is different than not speaking. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I mean, there are different dimensions of it.
Yeah, definitely. I guess
right.
it would be, yeah, of course.
I mean, if let's just say if Kabbalists were truly committed to not speaking or silence, then we would have nothing of which to speak.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So so on balance, they clearly were much more committed to this way of both speaking and not speaking.
Yeah. Well, one could think about certain types of esotericism in this sense.
Right. Exactly. Right.
But of course, it's always the one could say the Habermasian question would always be, what kind of truth could that be that has to be hidden for the public? That would be that, and this it could be in this sense really a question, like I said, for philosophy. What is the meaning of philosophy?
Right.
If there is a truth, then the truth is that's Aufklärung, enlightenment. Then the truth is for everybody.
Yeah.
What kind of truth couldn't be for everybody?
Well,
Yeah. Well, I know. Yeah, but
Well, one thinks of Strauss here. Leo
yeah.
Strauss.
well, with Strauss though, it's really is more political expediency than anything, right?
Well, exactly.
Oh, but actually,
the
yeah,
philosopher.
You're right, actually. Yeah.
Well, let's say his study of Maimonides, right? So we know what Maimonides felt was dangerous, or at least according to Strauss's reading. So it goes against. The philosopher actually has to do just the opposite. The philosopher has to conceal.
yeah. Well, but if not, he is killed. So yeah, that's yeah.
Right.
So to say the truth blankly is like dynamite for human society. So we have to learn.
Yeah. I've come to learn it's true in academic society as well.
Let me just add,
yeah.
I'll jump in. Here I'll take my privilege as a Strauss in the apostolic succession, actually to make an anti-Straussian point, which is Leibowitz says, the one really profound thing I got from Leibowitz was that he points out that some of the things that Strauss thinks the philosopher has to conceal according to Maimonides are proclaimed in the initial sentences of the Mishnah Torah.
Okay.
So it's it's like there's some difficulty with what Strauss says. The other thing I just, in relation to this discussion, is I wouldn't want to elide the distinction between speaking about something and saying something. There are things you can't maybe talk about, but you can say them nonetheless. And because once you talk about them, that means something very different from speaking them. Professors like to say they learned something from cab drivers, but I'm going to give you an example of the time I tried to give Musar to a cab driver. The cab driver starts telling me about how he took his wife to the Dead Sea and how they made love so many times and he felt like a young man. And I said to him, look, I don't think you should be telling me about this aspect of your relationship with your wife. She didn't do these things so that you would tell me. It's not something to talk about. Okay. On the other hand, it would be fine for him to speak his love to his wife, but he can't say it to me. He can say it to her, right? So there's a fundamental distinction between talking about something and talking something which, different, or not just one distinction, but that grammatical distinction can point to some very important differences that I think it's important not to elide in this context. But do you want to say something?
I just want to actually to add to this idea of the difference between not speaking, in other words, being silent. The way you put it was speaking not. I forget the locution.
Speaking not, which is a kind of apophatic discourse.
Right. So you're speaking,
which is still a gesture of speaking.
Right. So it's a gesture of speaking. But somehow the speaking it collapses, negates itself somehow. Yeah. It points. That's its apophasis. It's pointing, as it were, beyond itself.
Because you're saying the unsayable.
Right. So that in itself, of course, already means that type of speaking needs to be esoteric, even in Straussian sense,
right.
Because you can't talk that way to people. Right. You can't say to people, let's give a crude example. We know in the Zohar, there's talk of God's penis.
Oh, exactly. That's exactly.
So you can't tell people God has a penis. People are going to be like, "What are you in there?" I mean, that's so. Everything is wrong with that statement, right?
Even for the masters of the esoteric wisdom,
yeah,
right. The secret persists. They speak of let's say they speak of the sacred union of male and female.
Yeah.
But they're all living, thinking in the shadow of Maimonides. None of them think God is literally a body.
Exactly, right.
So what do we do with all of this erotic and anthropomorphic language? So it means that there's a secret here. There's something inherently secretive about this gnosis, even to the one who's the master of it.
Let me try to understand this a little bit. I'll tell you what I understand, and you tell me. It seems like you're going a little bit farther than what I understand, so I want to get it. There's certain statements that a person would like to make about God, which cannot be said in plain language. So you use incredibly colorful language, such as in the Zohar. And in prosaic conversation, that colorful language is obscene, it's politically disruptive, it's upsetting, it's
theologically flawed.
It's theologically flawed, it's X-rated, everything is wrong about it. Nevertheless, that's the language you need to use. Now, why?
Right.
Why are you
Right,
using
right.
that language? Why?
Right.
And by what right are you using that language? By virtue of the fact that the one who is initiated into that type of discursivity, because not everyone should be initiated, not everyone can handle that type of language. Sure. Yeah. So you have to be selected and say, look, we're going to talk now, but you need to know how to hear what I'm going to say. If you're going to hear me like the guy, like the cab driver, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm going to shut up, right? But if you understand that everything that I say negates itself, everything that I say is pointing beyond what I'm saying, it's not bound by language, then I will tell you things, but you have to be prepared to listen in that way. But now, are you saying there's something even more? Because at that level, all I've said now is that I've explained why I'm keeping things a secret from the public. But you seem to want to say something even deeper, that even on a higher level, there's still a higher level secret happening.
Right, there's something inexplicable even for the master of this wisdom. There's an inexplicability that can never be rendered completely transparent.
So in other words, not only the student,
not only the student, the master,
but the master himself is somehow tripped up by his own.
Not tripped, is given to the mystery, given to the secret.
And yet he speaks.
There's no choice but to speak.
But when he's doing that, he's as it were confounded by his own language. Is he shocked by his own language? Does he know he's saying nothing? I mean, what does that mean from his perspective? He understands something, presumably, no? When he's speaking, understand.
Yeah, but
no word is going to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how else to say. I mean, the verse is "Sod Adonai l're'av." The secret, the way the Kabbalists understand it, is the secret belongs to those who fear Him. Mm-hmm. So there is an inherent secrecy to the very wisdom and experience of the divine. I don't know how else to.
Yeah,
I don't know how else. I don't know how else to say it.
I wondered if I could maybe bring it back to poetry. I think that I imagine the great poets, and even the lesser poets, even the more ordinary poets, poets have said things like this, that, and I'm sure you've had this experience from writing, and you have as well, and artwork and so on. When you write a poem, or any work of art, and Poiēsis in the big sense of the word, there are those truly exquisite moments where you're so painfully aware that this is not you doing this.
Yeah.
That something so great is happening, and you only are privileged to participate in it and to bring to light a certain aspects of it. And then you stand back and you go, how the heck did that happen? How did this wonderful thing happen? Surely it's not me, because it's beyond my finite powers. So you have a feeling that something extraordinary is going on, and there's a sense of loss.
So I think this
poet is lost.
This is different than the political esotericism, leaving aside Leibovich's criticism of Strauss. And I'm not just saying necessarily I agree with Strauss totally, but for Maimonides, it does seem to me correct to say it's a political esotericism, which is to say, he had to conceal certain things because he knew they would run up against the common beliefs of his day. So he concealed them. But for those who know, there is no more secret. And if I could share a personal anecdote, my second qualifying exam as a doctoral student was on Kabbalistic and philosophical commentaries on Genesis and the Chariot in the 13th century. Alexander Altman was one of the examiners, and he said, "So, Mr. Wolfson, what really is the secret for Maimonides?" So I said, "The secret is that there is no secret," and he clapped his hands. But by contrast, for the Kabbalists, you can never say that.
Right.
There is something inherently secret about the wisdom they're transmitting, and it can never be rendered unsecretive. It has to persist. That's why I quoted that passage from Heidegger where he says about the Geheimnis that it always, I forget the exact language now, but that it always, the mystery is that it always persists as the mystery.
I think I would like to use this thought, with your leave, to try to articulate what I was trying to say before, that namely that this, first of all, makes a lot of sense to me that at, you know, at the highest level of religion in general, we're going to be the secret is so large that nobody can get around the secret.
Or impenetrable.
The secret is impenetrable, and I am subject to the secret. I'm not a master of the secret.
One gives oneself to the secret.
Right. So, and I'm suggesting that Poiēsis, as Hölderlin and Heidegger understand it, has this element to it. When Heidegger speaks, for example, of belonging to being, you know, and as it were, submitting to being. It's like an Eved. It's really a servant. He's a servant. He's a shepherd of being. He's a servant of being. He's giving into it, to its mastery, which I think is authentic and beautiful. I wonder, not to contradict any of that, but to add to that again, that what's beautiful about the Torah is that in addition to that, in addition to this profound secret dimension, which perhaps shows up in such a radical way in Isaiah, in Yechezkel, in Ezekiel 1:26, where that, as it were, that's as it were. I mean, traditionally, it's the seed of Kabbalah, as it were, right? Where Genesis 1:26 gets flipped around, and suddenly, what? You saw God? He looks like a guy? He sits on a sapphire throne, right? I mean, isn't that crazy, Ezekiel? Well, yeah, it is kind of crazy. Don't tell everybody, you know? It's a secret. So, as well as that, there's a communication such that it's dafka not a secret. And that's the miracle. I would call that the primordial miracle of the Torah. Not the parting of the sea is a tiny, tiny miracle. I would go further. I would say that the creation of the world, in a sense, is a small miracle compared to the linguistic feat that only God can accomplish, which is that given the essential secrecy and the essential inscrutability and impenetrability of everything, God nevertheless, by divine power and fiat, God traverses all the way from the infinite to the finite and makes something completely clear and unsecretive. It's a non-secret.
And what is completely clear and unsecretive?
What is completely, well, not completely clear, not completely, but very clear,
yeah,
and adequately clear. I would say that there are 613 pretty clear things. They're pretty clear. They're not 100% clear. There's a lot to be said about them. In fact, you could fill up a few volumes and call it the Talmud. And then when that's not done, you can start doing, Shulchan Aruch. And when that's not done, do another Shulchan Aruch. Why not? Keep adding. But there's an adequacy. There's an adequacy to the commandment as spoken. I don't like the word commandment. I think it's a bad translation. Of course, mitzvah, tzavta, and so on.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, actually, I'll leave it at that point. That the Hasidic tradition, and I don't know the sources of this, Elliot, so please help me out. But the Hasidic tradition, at least in Chabad for sure, always insists on the etymological root of the word mitzvah.
Down?
Yeah, from tzavta to be connected. Yeah, in Aramaic, right? Tzavta. It's in the Mishnah, the word tzavta. So instead of saying commandment, which to me sounds like such a Kantian word, gebot, hitting you over the head, to say that's not a mitzvah. A mitzvah is a connection between me and Hashem. That connection is something that only Hashem can do, because only Hashem has the power to master language and to say, look, language I know. When I talk to the poets, they're going to be discombobulated because I'm trying to reveal tremendous things to them. But at the same time, I will say certain things that even the maidservant standing at the mountain of Sinai who just cleaned the toilets, and she's not a very educated lady, and she's standing in Mount Sinai, and she goes, yeah, I get that. I understand that. So that's a divine feat that takes place with language. So that's how I would say, even though I accept his understanding of Poiēsis, but I would say that it's inadequate to what happens in the Torah. I'm getting Elliot Wolfson to nod, and that is
Well,
one of the sweetest things I have experienced in a very, very long time.